All right, welcome back to Never Did It. I'm Brad Garoon, and I got a mosquito bite in my eye, so that's why that looks that way. I'm here with Jake Ziegler, as always, and we are joined by a very special guest today. It's Kevin Ford. We're doing an episode that involves wrestling, so Kevin Ford is joining us. Thank you, Kevin. It's 1989. Let's start with that movie. So Jake saw that I didn't have No Holds Barred checked on Letterboxd, marked on Letterboxd. It's true. I haven't seen it. At the very least, I haven't seen it since I was a little kid. There's a chance I'd never seen it at all the way through. A lot of this stuff was new to me. Jake, why did you think it was important that we watched and that you rewatched No Holds Barred?
Because it's, as a wrestling fan, I feel like it's just something you had to have done at least once. It was the first starring role for Hulk Hogan. It was a big deal when we were kids. I remember they promoted the crap out of this thing when it was coming out in 1989. Really, in the lead up to WrestleMania 5 came out over that summer. And plus, it's got a great villainous performance by Kurt Fuller. It introduces to Zeus, the character Zeus, who then went on to actually wrestle in several matches on major pay-per-views, and in fact was actually rumored to make it all the way to WrestleMania 6, which and thankfully ended up not happening. But I don't know, are there other movies that have actually ever introduced a character that became, until suicide happened in the teenage? Well, that was from a video game, not a movie. But anyway, I thought it was kind of an interesting factoid that the movie introduced a character that ended up wrestling in matches. And like I said, just as a wrestling fan, I feel like if you haven't done No Holds Barred once, you need to have did it. And so I wanted you to did it.
It's not a 1-to-1 comparison, but we did get WCW champion David Arquette after Ready to Rumble.
Right.
Kevin, I mean, I know you've seen No Holds Barred, but what was your relationship with this movie? Did you think of it fondly or did you think of it objectively?
Objectively, because I didn't see it as a kid. My video store didn't have it. I knew of it, but it was just something like my stores didn't carry, so I didn't see it until they finally put it out on Blu-ray and DVD in 2012.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and that's when I first watched it. Yeah, it's not good, clearly, but it is like Jake said. I remember everyone talking about it felt like a huge thing if you were watching at that time, and so I was just sort of like what Jake said. It feels like I do feel like if you're a wrestling fan, you do have to see it. I was stunned Brad had not seen it yet, so when I saw that on the list, I was like, I want to be there for when Brad first sees it. But no, I actually had seen my dad, just knowing I was a wrestling fan as a kid, bought me the VHS of Suburban Commando. So that was my Hulk Hogan film as a kid. And I think I saw Mr. Nanny on cable or something like that. But no, I had not seen it until that Blu-ray dropped about a decade or so ago.
I say that's just crazy to me because I saw No Holds Barred. I watched this movie dozens of times probably as a kid, and I loved it too. No shame. I loved it then. Not so much now, but I definitely loved it then.
Well, you had it marked at 2 stars on Letterboxd even before this watch. How many times have you seen it?
Hard to count just because, again, most of the times I saw it were well before the Letterboxd era. But if I had to guess, I'd say it's probably north of 20.
Wow, that's too many times. I
was a kid.
Yeah, I could tell you, I watched Ready to Rumble a bunch. I watched Beyond the Mat a bunch. So it's just I'm a kid and there's a wrestling movie. I would have, if I was Jake's age and had that, I would have watched it that many times too as a kid, no doubt.
Fair enough. I do want to talk a little bit later about Suburban Commando. Like you, Kevin, Suburban Commando was my Hulk Hogan movie. I saw that in the theater and I loved it. And then I watched it again this week. So let's talk about No Holds Barred first. So Hulk Hogan is Rip. Does Rip have a last name?
Not that I know of.
I think he does.
I feel like in the beginning they say a last name once and then never again. Rip Thomas. And he is essentially playing, instead of the orange and yellow Hulk Hogan, he's the blue and white Rip, but it's the same character.
Is it M, like Rip M? Because he's got that on his shirt, apostrophe M. Is that his last name? Rip M? Yeah.
Rip him?
Yeah, Rip him. I think that's his last name.
That's too clever for this film.
So, okay, Hulk is Rip. He's the World Wrestling Federation champion. All the WWF trademarks are in this. Vince McMahon was a producer, an executive producer on this movie. It shows. I feel like he had a lot of creative control. The actual director of this movie is a guy named Thomas J. Wright, who was a total journeyman. He produced directed some softcore porny type stuff. He directed some BBC movie of the week type stuff, but not an auteur filmmaker by any stretch of the imagination. And so in watching this, it felt like Vince had a lot of say in the creative direction of this movie. There's a lot of victimizing women in this movie. But Rip is the World Wrestling Federation champion. A rival network wants him to be on their network because that's how wrestling works. They just want to get one wrestler over to their network. He says no. We don't know who is in charge of WWF or why he's so loyal to them, but He's loyal. That's all we need to know. So he and his plucky brother decide not to go over to Kurt Fuller's evil network. And then Kurt Fuller starts an underground, basically raw underground, where the fights are won by knockout. The only rule is don't kill the other guy. And then Zeus shows up because anyone can join the battle of the tough guys. Zeus is played by Tiny Lister, who Jake talked about for a while. He challenges Rip and finally gets Rip to fight him because by happenstance, Rip's brother goes to spy on the competition and ends up getting beaten into the hospital. Yeah, that's it. And meanwhile, a woman who is Hulk's publicist is really a villain in disguise, and she's been spying on him, and there's all kinds of hijinks with that. Anyway, this movie's the hottest of garbage. Probably the worst movie we've reviewed on this. It actually, I do think, is quite the competition between this and Never Say Never Again as the worst movie to be reviewed on this podcast. I was shocked. Jake, you texted me and you said, it's amazing that Hulk Hogan could hold 50,000 people in the palm of his hand with a promo. And yet in this movie, he can't string two words together or produce a single human emotion. All he does is grunt. It was kind of hard to get through. I will say for the first 30 minutes, I was like, this is like so bad it's good. And then it gets real boring. Kev, what'd you think of No Holds Barred?
I also gave it 2 stars. I don't think it's as bad as people think it is, but I do think there is something starting kind of okay and then getting boring. And I even was reading this review from Gene Siskel where he said it was lacking the campy quality of the WWF. And I kind of think that's true because you get some really silly stuff in the beginning, but once Zeus gets there, it gets pretty serious and dark. And it's like, well, let's figure out a tone here and stick with it. And it did kind of lack that charm. And I think if they had just gone full bore campy, it would have been a much more enjoyable watch.
Totally. Like Jake, earlier you said there's a great movie villain in this in Kurt Fuller. I was really scared you were going to say there's a great movie villain in this in Zeus because Zeus is boring. And Kurt Fuller's CEO business tycoon character is hilarious. He's so funny and over the top. But then he disappears for like an hour so that Zeus can grunt and beat up Stan Hansen. Also, Stan Hansen is hilarious, and they just drop him after a minute. I don't know. I'm so confused. I wonder if what happened was Vince was like, yeah, this Kurt Fuller guy, he's doing me great. And then after a while, I was like, I don't want this to be on TV, actually, or in the movie theater. And then they moved on to the big bad black man being the bad guy.
Which is funny because I see him as more of an analog in the whole thing for TBS and Ted Turner. Because it's like, oh, I own a TV network. I buy things. It was shot in Atlanta. They didn't put it in Atlanta, but I felt more of it that way than I did Vince.
Yeah, maybe. But what's his name?
Not
Ted
that it was direct shot. It just sort of happened that way.
Right. And Ted Turner was never really like an on-screen character at all for WCW.
No.
The craziest thing to me is that Mark Pellegrino is in this movie as the brother who gets beat up. I'm like, this guy's been in real series. He was in Dexter and he was very good in it. He was in Mulholland Drive and he's like very good in his Mulholland Drive moment. And yet he's the child, or not the child. I guess he's an adult in No Holds Barred. And I couldn't really understand the relationship between his character and Hulk. I know they're brothers. At first I was like, is he like special needs? Like, why are we treating him like he's so precious?
There's like no depth to anybody in this movie.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, he's his brother.
And that's it.
I said this is the movie that turned him into Jacob, the Man in Black, and Lost.
Oh my God, I forgot he was the Man in Black. And he's not the Man in Black. He's
oh, you're right. Yes.
He is Jacob, and the Man in Black
but
is
he's
his
not
brother.
the Man in Black, right?
Right. Joan Severance is in this movie. She's very pretty, and that is all they let her do in this movie is be pretty.
And want to have sex with Hulk Hogan.
Well, she secretly does, but she knows it's not her job because immediately after she doesn't have sex with Hulk Hogan, she goes to Kurt Fuller and tells him basically how much she wants to have sex with Hulk Hogan.
I mean, those push-ups, man, they really will do it to you.
Funniest moment in the whole movie was panning to Hulk Hogan doing push-ups, being so deep in steroid bloat that like his skin is barely holding on, and then her just doing the heels. That twist was so stupid. I couldn't get over how much I hated that in one scene she is convincingly repulsed by him, and in the next, no, he's a nice guy, and she was a bad guy all along.
Did you spot Buff Bagwell in the movie?
Mm-mm.
And when it's like the crowd of kids and they're outside and then the plane lands with Kurt Fuller and them, he's one of like, you could see him a couple times in the background right there.
No, I never would have even thought to have looked for him. I know that's like spotting Rob McElhenney in Wonder Boys.
No, really?
I'll send you a screenshot later.
I've seen this movie, like I said, north of 20 times. That's the first time I've ever heard that.
The only good, like, catch him if you catch him cameo is the dude who plays Bane is the...
Jeep Swenson.
Yeah, Jeep Swenson, who I was not a WCW guy, so I didn't know him. But when I saw his body, I'm like, that body looks familiar. And then he is Bane from Batman and Robin. And that's it. Stan Hansen's fun. He gets to do a lot. He probably should have been in more movies.
I couldn't figure out why he was in this because he was not a WWF guy, like, at all. How did he get connected with this project, and how did Vince especially like give him dialogue and like funny line? Teeny Wanger was something that Vince probably thought was the funniest thing he's ever heard. Second funniest thing after Dookie, probably. Was probably like Dookie is probably peak Vince comedy, and then Teeny Wanger is probably number two. And of course, we should mention too, for anybody who really knows wrestling or Vince or whatever, that the story goes according to Vince and Hogan, or at least according to Hogan. I know Hogan has said this, is that Vince and Hogan, did like a full rewrite of the movie, like stayed in a hotel for like just 2 days and rewrote the whole thing, start to finish or whatever. And I don't know how true it is, but like you said, I definitely think there was at least some measure of creative control by Vince, because it definitely feels like Vince's type of comedy in a lot of respects.
Yeah, I had actually forgotten that story, but now I can picture them as talking heads telling it. But now but the whole time I'm watching the movie, I was like, Vince wrote these jokes.
Yes.
100%.
Yeah.
I have a theory about the Stan Hansen thing. I think it's that Vince didn't want WWF guys jobbing out in the movie. So he brought in guys who he had a relationship with, like Stan Hansen had been in WWF. Before, I think he left in '82, but he did a run, so they had a relationship, and all the other guys were probably just like local Georgia dudes.
Do you think Terry Funk teases him about he gets to be in Roadhouse in 1989, and Stan Hansen was in No Holds Barred?
So I bet there was a time when that was the case. Although Stan Hansen probably wasn't mad about the money he made from No Holds Barred.
No, I'm sure he doesn't care.
No Holds Barred, we should say, was a big hit. I mean, okay, it was a modest hit. It's a big hit by today's standards. Like, if a movie was made for $8 million today and made $16 million, that's huge by today's standards. Back then, modest hit. This is a great time to go into. Jake mentioned before, Hogan couldn't string two words together in this movie. I went and watched Suburban Commando afterwards because I remembered Hogan being kind of charismatic and a decent enough actor, and he was. Suburban Commando is like solid. It's not a good movie. It's got Christopher Lloyd in it though, so that's that helped. Shelley Duvall does absolutely nothing in Suburban Commando,
but she's in it.
She wears a wig and kisses Christopher Lloyd, and that's the entirety of what she does in the film. And it's got The Undertaker with a child's voice in one of the better gags for a family movie.
It's a good bit.
And the movie works better. So New Line Cinema produced both of these, and it's just very clear that Vince stopped being involved after No Holds Barred, and Suburban Commando got to be like your total run-of-the-mill regular family comedy without weird poop and dick jokes. And Hogan is he's not a good actor, and I hate to give him this kind of credit or to rip on The Rock, I don't hate to rip on The Rock, but Hogan is at least as good in Suburban Commando as The Rock is in some of his children's movies.
Pacifier? So there's that. Yeah. No, not Pacifier. What's the game plan? Yeah,
or the Tooth Fairy. Pacifier is Vin Diesel?
Yes.
Yeah, Pacifier is Vin Diesel, yeah.
So I want to just run down this real quick because I fell into a pretty deep rabbit hole. What is Hogan's Hollywood journey? How did this happen? Let's break this down also for people who listen to us who don't, at this point, we're probably way too deep into the conversation. Anyone who doesn't watch wrestling and is listening to this is either fast forward it or turn this off by now. So Hulk Hogan in the late 70s is a heel in WWF, but he's pretty popular as a heel. And he's very charismatic. He does Rocky III. Vince Sr., Vince McMahon, who we now know from Netflix fame. If you're not a wrestling fan, you've seen his face on Netflix now. His father owned the company back then, did not want Hogan to do Rocky III. And that was one factor in Hogan getting let out of his WWF contract back then. He does Rocky III. That's a giant hit. I think it's the second most successful Rocky movie after Rocky IV, or maybe also if you count Creed, it's number 3. But it's up there. Rocky III was really the heights of the Rocky franchise. So Hogan got huge exposure by doing that. Then he comes back to he does New Japan. He wins the IWGP Championship, but not the version that is the IWGP Championship now. In fact, there's been a bunch of them. New Japan is stupid when it comes to title lineages. And he becomes insanely popular as a babyface in the AWA, which is Midwestern nonsense that Jake liked as a kid.
I grew up on it.
Right. But AWA won't make him the top star, so Vince Jr. gets him back and makes him the biggest wrestling star of all time up to that point. And then 5 years later, they make a movie. I think they're a little late. Right? By 89, he's on the downturn. He's still super popular, but it's starting to peter out. which is why I think by 91, when they make Suburban Commando, Vince is like, I'm not so interested in your movie career anymore. No Holds Barred didn't make $100 million. This isn't going to be like a big cash cow for us. And then Hogan makes No Holds Barred, Suburban Commando, which is also kind of successful, but less so than No Holds Barred. And then he makes Mr. Nanny, which I also think is like totally competent. It has what's his name as the villain, which is really fun.
New York Dolls feeling hot guy.
Yeah, Buster Poindexter, who I have seen live in concert. That makes half the box office of Suburban Commando, and now Hogan's career is pretty much over. He only has one starring role again after that. It's Santa with Muscles. It's super low budget. It made $200,000 at the box office, and I think cost like $1 million to make. And in the meantime, he's doing so a lot of people remember Thunder in Paradise as a movie, I've noticed, but it's just several episodes of the TV show that were released together on VHS. And then he just did real straight-to-video crap until nothing by the end of the 90s, despite the fact that he had a resurgence in popularity in the mid-90s. He has a couple cameos. He has a cameo in like Sherlock Gnomes 2, I think.
Three Ninjas, High Noon, Mega Mountain.
So those two, Gremlins and Three Ninjas. Well, Gremlins was during the height of his popularity, that cameo, and he plays himself. Three Ninjas is I think between Mr. Nanny and Santa with Muscles. So he's pretty much done at that point.
He's WCW.
Yeah. So yeah, it's just like a weird journey. And then a few years later, he said the N-word on a sex tape, and now anyone who's normal doesn't like him. So that's it.
I got a couple dive points to make here. First, on Jake's point about WrestleMania 6, which is why I wore my Umaga Ultimate Warrior shirt today. The word is that they did in December of 89 No Holds Barred on pay-per-view, where you could either just buy the movie or buy the movie with an exclusive match, which was a cage match, Hulk Hogan and Brutus Beefcake against Macho King Randy Savage and Zeus, which is on the Blu-ray, which is nice. And allegedly, the amount of people who purchased the pay-per-view with the match was so low that they gauged that the interest for a Zeus Hulk Hogan match at WrestleMania would also be low, which resulted in the pivot to Ultimate Warrior versus Hogan, which is a weird good guy versus good guy match they didn't really do at the time. So that's why you get that, which kind of checks out because they never did the singles. They blow off the Macho King part of it at the Saturday Night's Main Event, and then WrestleMania 6 is what it is. But to Jake's point about fans his age watching on VHS over and over and loving it, it's beloved so much by wrestling fans that in 2022, Mattel, as their San Diego Comic-Con exclusive, put out a No Holds Barred figure pack, which if you take out, you can also see them, and there's the WTV like studio awesome in the back if you pull that out. And the thing that I love the most, because it comes with a bunch of extra heads and hands and stuff, is they made the weird rip 'em hands, the rip 'em signal for Hogan there. So that's the only time they did that. And then it just like a little VHS pull out too, because I think even when they made it, they were really expecting it to be sell a ton of tapes and rentals and pay-per-views and stuff, not even just counting on the theatrical release at the time. So yeah, it definitely still has a place in people's minds and hearts, displaced or not, nostalgic or not. But I'm glad, Brad, you have now seen it, even if you didn't enjoy it.
Yeah, it's really disappointing because while Kurt Fuller was on my screen so much, I was like, this movie's actually going to be fun. And then it's just not. Like, we spent so much time in the hospital. It's so boring. Joan Severance gets kidnapped like 3 times.
Gotta have a reason for Hulk to beat up people for some reason. Destroy a gym with people watching it live on the video feed.
Just destroy a restaurant. You know, you got to destroy that restaurant to save everybody. That's my man. That's my man.
I could not get over how happy that woman was to have her restaurant destroyed. That was wild.
Not even the best movie in 89 to have a restaurant destroyed.
Quick thing I want to mention. I will say about Zeus, not a great villain to watch now, but in those times I watched it as a kid, scared the crap out of me. Like when I'm like 6, 7, or 7, 8 years old watching it. So like as a kid, very effective bad guy. As an adult, nothing. Kurt Fuller is way more awesome. But when we mentioned some of the wrestlers in it, Stan Hansen and everything, Demolition Axe is in the movie, which of course I did not know as a kid. Like that did not even register with me that he's the first guy that Hogan faces in the beginning. But that's, you know, Bill Eadie, Demolition Axe, which, yeah, again, I didn't realize until I was much older.
Which speaks to Brad's point about not wanting to put actual WWF people against him. Just take off the face paint, put on some eyeliner, put him in trunks, and you got a whole new person.
Right. The other thing is it's a real indictment of and lets you know like that the steroid trial was inevitable because Bill Eadie in WWF did not never struck me as a big guy compared to other wrestlers. And in this movie, he looks enormous. And so when I watch WWF, I'm like, wait, why is he so small? It's just because everyone else is so unreal big. Pretty wild stuff. So, Kevin, I think this was your idea that we would also watch because right around the same time, two big wrestling things hit Netflix. One is Mr. McMahon, which was a documentary about Vince McMahon that kind of got away from him. I think he thought it was going to be a puff piece, and then it wasn't. But everyone's talking about that, so we're not going to talk about that. Also, I haven't watched it. Queen of Villains, which is a 5-part drama about the beginning of the career, really actually the whole first half of Dump Matsumoto's career. She's a female a Joshi Pro Wrest. Wow, I hate that I just said that. She is
But you said it right.
I did. Yeah. A female wrestler from Japan who was incredibly popular in the 80s and has been, I think, a little bit forgotten compared to a lot of her contemporaries, given how intensely popular she was, or intensely hated she was, as one of the top heels in All Japan Women's Wrestling in the 1980s. So that's what this was about. It's about the first 2 episodes are about her getting into wrestling, and then in the 3rd episode she finally starts wrestling, and the last 2 are about her wrestling career. It kind of flies through it. So what was your interest in this?
Well, I was just really surprised that Netflix did something like this. I don't know. I just didn't anticipate them being like, oh, let's do a show about an 80s Japanese wrestler, like a 5-episode series, both subtitled and dubbed, and put that on Netflix. It just really caught me by surprise that it was even something that was going to happen. And I know that there's a lot of love for 80s All Japan Women's Wrestling from diehard wrestling fans online. I know the names, but I had seen very, very little of it. And the trailer looked excellent. So I thought, well, if we're going to be talking about a bad wrestling movie, let's watch something good to go along with it. And I really, really liked this series.
Wow.
I think it's a case of like things like the Iron Claw, where the less you know, the better. And since I only knew names and didn't really know a lot of the real stories, a lot of it was really interesting. I'd be looking up stuff either after, like what is and what isn't true. And you could tell there are some things that even just some stuff that's like, how she got to be Dump Matsumoto is really not that interesting. I think she just like announced herself as that after like a 5K or something. So the way they do it in the show is just way more interesting and fun. And I was okay with that. I thought the actress, I guess she's a comedian in Japan who played her, is fantastic. Really good roles all around. And it was just like fun to be in that universe for a little while. I do think some of the episodes are a bit long. I actually would have preferred it to be maybe more episodes and a little shorter, and maybe even a little bit deeper into like Jaguar, Toyota, whoever who like goes off to Mexico and comes back. That's kind of brushed over, things like that. But as it stands, so I really liked it. What I can say about it as a positive is I watched the first episode by myself. Then I popped on the second episode about the beginning. My wife happened to be in the room, and she's like standing and watching it for a little bit. And then she sits down and watches the whole episode with me, and then watches 3, 4, and 5 with me. The rest of it, she got really sucked into it and loved it. So that's my thoughts.
What do you think, Jake?
I liked quite a bit of it. I thought it was a really, really interesting and really well acted, especially that main actress. I'm sorry, I don't know her name.
Her name's Yurion Retriever.
Retriever, that's right. Yeah, it was an interesting last name. I thought she was really good, and I think like the transformation is done pretty well. There was I had just some issues with the way a lot of like the wrestling was presented. Just it seemed the series seemed really confused, like at how real or how scripted the wrestling was, and it just like kind of seemed to vary almost like scene to scene. Okay, is this part scripted, and then is this part going to be real, and are these in this scene, or are they going to go along with the script in this scene? And some of it worked well, I think, for the dramatic purposes, and then some of it did not work as well and was just like really frustrating, and it was almost there was a little bit of a tonal disconnect for me in some of those scenes. But a lot of the dramatic stuff I thought worked really well. I think the acting was all really good. I think the wrestling scenes were really well done. The obviously whoever was training them, it was the real Shigusa, right? The Shigusa was one of the trainers. I think I read on that, was one of the advisors and trainers on the movie. So I think the wrestling scenes were all really well put together. I was really uncomfortable in that last singles match with all the violence in it and the blood. Those just like, I mean, I know even more, like I know this was faker than an actual, I hate to use the word faker, but I mean, this was, like more put together than like an actual wrestling match. And I was still like, this is just really uncomfortable and bloody and violent, and I don't like watching this. But I mean, obviously that's what they were going for. So I think it was all really well done, but I had an issue with just with how confused the series felt with it at how much of the wrestling was scripted versus how much of it they were shooting or going into business for themselves. It just didn't feel consistent.
Yeah. So I didn't like this show. I was pretty into the first episode. I was like, oh, the vibe of it's cool. The sort of like storybook cinematography I thought was really neat. The way that Kaoru Matsumoto, before she becomes Dump, the way that she had to deal with her dirtbag dad kind of felt like almost an early Tim Burton kind of accentuated reality, like a magic reality that she'd have to escape. into the world of wrestling. And then I felt like they stripped all that away in subsequent episodes. And I thought it was a lot visually less interesting to watch. Jake, you mentioned confused. I think it's not only confused about the wrestling. You put that perfectly. I felt the exact same way. I was like, why are they pretending that so many of these things are shoots? That doesn't add anything really to the story. And it wasn't like what was, in this way, I agree with you, Kevin. Like that was not a big thing in AJW in the 80s. Like we're real wrestlers and we're fake wrestlers. There was like and still is, in New Japan now, you have not the Bullet Club, the evil House of Torture.
Yes, House of Torture.
Right, and they come in and cheat, and it's boring. And people want wrestling for wrestling's sake, not with all the actual garbage gimmicks. You very much could have just had that be the tension, and it was, but you didn't need this is real and this is scripted. And that was a tension between the brothers. So these like 3 or 4 brothers ran All Japan Women's Wrestling, which is true. Like some of them wanted it to be scripted, some of them not. Even if that's true, the fact that they focused on the promoters so much near the end really bothered me. And what killed me was that the last shot in the whole series was the benevolent promoter letting a little girl into the arena and then sitting satisfied at the concession stand. I'm like, this isn't about him. It's about the women. Why are we spending the last shot on this guy? This is, to me, the whole show was very confused. Tonally, when it would go back to her stuff with her dad, the fact that her dad had like a snap babyface turn, which I absolutely hated, just by the daughter saying, he had a heart attack and he's good now. No, that's terrible. Terrible storytelling. I totally agree that Yurion Retriever did a great job. In fact, I think she's one of the only ones who did a great job. I did not like the woman who played Chigusa Nagayo. I thought she was very one note. And the real Chigusa Nagayo is so charismatic and so dynamic. And also, like, yes, at the time, her being pretty and Lioness Asuka being pretty was a big deal. But throughout the rest of Chigusa Nagayo's career, she has not focused on that at all. She gained a lot of weight. She's real big. It's all about being tough now. You know, you mentioned that she was part of the training. It makes total sense. Her company, Gaia, or not now her company is Oz Academy, I think. But before that, she did Gaia, which also has a great documentary about it, in which, Jake, when you and I were in college, our pro wrestling friends showed us a clip from this movie, Gaia Girls, where Meiko Sadamoto dropkicks someone so hard that it caves in her face, basically. So much of what All Japan Women's Wrestling has become is like being tough and strong. And there's some of that in the training. But I also, like, you said you liked the wrestling. I found it so boring, especially compared to the real matches. So much. It reminded me of the stuff that goes on in WWE main events now, where there's so much like story infused into the match, and there should always be story, but like overt story where they're talking into a microphone or talking too much into the camera during the match, and it slows the action way down. That's what I felt about the action in this. And the fact is, some of the matches in the show were longer than the real matches in real life. That is wild to me. You don't need the whole match. And it brings up a question I have for y'all, which is, let's exclude this because it seems like you liked the action in this more than I did. What movie do you think has portrayed the actual professional wrestling of it most cinematically, like the action in the ring?
Probably Iron Claw.
Oh, interesting. I guess I do think that the Von Erich versus Ric Flair match is really great, even though Flair's impression of Flair, the guy who plays Flair's impression of Flair, is bad. But I do think that gets across what he's feeling in that moment really well. So yeah, I'll give you that, because by and large, I think most movies don't know how to get across like what wrestling is actually trying to do with the action of wrestling.
Yeah, and I think that's really hard to do dramatically, but I think what this movie did well, I think, yeah, there's a lot of like dialogue and getting on the microphone and doing all that. And I just kind of think that's just the way it's going to work in a drama series or a drama movie, is that wrestling is a really hard thing to understand for the uninitiated. And in this series, I mean, you're not going to get any uninitiated people. Like, how many people are going to just walk in? Like Kevin, you said your wife, kind of came into it and enjoyed it. And I think that maybe if people did take that chance, they might enjoy this series. But how many people are going to do that without someone, giving them that in? Like, oh, hey, you might like this series. I haven't seen, like, I follow Netflix and all the socials and everything. Like, I haven't seen one ad for this show. I wouldn't have known it existed unless, Kevin, you had pointed it out to me. So, like, I don't think there's going to be a huge audience for this show. So I just think that, wrestling is such a difficult medium to get into, that I think that's just how drama, is going to process wrestling matches. That it's just, it's just going to be a really hard thing to recreate, and to recreate it for an audience who's not immediately familiar with how pro wrestling works. I mean, how do you just, introduce that into a drama series if you haven't been, watching wrestling and, kind of understand how it works? I just think that's really difficult to do.
And then I think if you do watch wrestling, most wrestling in movies and TV is bad. It's like
You're
this
like, yeah,
isn't what it is.
You're watching it like, oh, this is bullcrap. This would never happen, you know?
Right. And even if it would happen, like it's not the thing that I'm watching wrestling for. Like what I think movies need to do, and I'm not sure what ice skating movies do this well, but competitive ice skating in film seems like a good analog, because what are you trying to do? You're trying to put on the best show. You're not actually competing. So maybe something like what made, well, I, Tonya is a bad example because it's not actually about the ice skating.
Well, so I watched The Cutting Edge a couple years ago, and yes, it's a love story, but it's also about building to them pulling off this really difficult thing. Where in wrestling, if it's like, oh, I finally win a match, it's like, well, yeah, but we know it's predetermined. So, you have to almost be like Randy the Ram getting the courage to do the headbutt at the end, and then, or, pulling off some hard to do thing. So it's very hard to do it that way. I also think just it being Japanese is also just a barrier of entry too, on top of it being wrestling or subtitled and all that stuff.
So two things. One, I think you're 100% right about, first off, The Cutting Edge was the movie I was looking for in my head and couldn't come up with it. That's why The Wrestler is so good. It's just a tragedy, so it doesn't feel good at the end of it. As far as it being Japanese, they did do promotion in Japan. They even put on a wrestling show. It was a one-match show, but they put on a wrestling show to promote this miniseries.
Gorgeous looking show.
And then they're
shot by Netflix, I think.
Yeah, it looks good, but also it was, here's my other problem with Queen of Villains. It made wrestling feel small. This was really popular. Like, people were freaking out about this stuff at the time. Dump was like, the stuff about people wanting to kill her, that was real. But they were drawing really big crowds. They were the #1 show on television several years in a row. Or at least like they would hit the highest rating on television several years in a row in Japan. And the crowds just like didn't look that big. And it kind of made it seem like they were always about to get kicked off TV. And I just, like, to me, it just didn't feel like the big, humongous spectacle that actually was happening at the time. Case in point, in the hair versus hair match, I told you guys over text the other day, I think they showed the wrong one. There were 2 hair versus hair matches in real life between them. And they should have shown the one where Chigusa won at the end, because that's the good guy winning at the end. But mostly because that match had Dump with a giant rainbow mohawk and crazy face paint. Meanwhile, I just have to mention that Dump Matsumoto was also known for wearing a swastika on her forehead, and I was so nervous that they were going to show that in the show, and I'm really glad that they didn't. But she had like there was so much more actual spectacle to these matches than they showed.
I would say, to that point, in that first match, I watched that before the show. They spend a lot of time at the end when they're cutting Chigusa Nagayo's hair, showing the crowd, and like women are like legitimately in tears, bawling over her getting her head shaved. And I think more focus on the fans and how Dump's actions made them feel more than just the other women wrestlers feel would have been very effective.
Yeah, the only part that I thought showed that was the sister's boyfriend being like, sorry, I have to watch this, and showing up to like a random bar that her dad happened to be at to watch the show. But that was just in service of having the sister and the dad be mad at each other, even though we don't care about the sister or the dad by this point. So I had a lot of problems with the show. Okay.
By the way, Brad, it's marvelous that she ran. That
marvelous.
Ran. Yeah, Oz was Naomi Ozaki.
Right, which is very small, marvelous. Very small. I'd be very impressed if any American fan was able to find a marvelous show of any kind aside from this Netflix one. And then just one more thing to both of your points with this not being promoted or popular. This is also, so on Letterboxd, I have many gripes, but one of my many gripes is anime and things from Japan in general tend to have like really inflated ratings. Like, there's lots of anime that I think is really mid that has like 4.0 on Letterboxd. This has a really high score on Letterboxd. And hearing that you guys both liked it makes me think, okay, it's probably a little more deserved. I might be in the minority. But it's all, when I look at the reviews, it's all people who are already familiar with All Japan Women. So it really is only people who are knowing about this because they're seeing it in wrestling media that are tuning in. There are very few casual people watching this show. And the fact that it's in Japanese is a big part of it. Although, what's her name did one of the voices.
Alexa Bliss did the dub.
Alexa Bliss.
Yeah.
Did you guys watch it in Japanese, or did you watch the dubbed version?
Well, I watched it subbed for the first 2.5 episodes, and I was like, I can't do this anymore. I'm not invested enough to watch this with the subtitles, so I switched over. And the character that Bliss voices does come back for like 3 seconds in the final episode. So
I'm not that person who's like, oh, I'd rather drink an ocean of poison than watch the dubs, but I just felt like watching the subtitles.
I saw that tweet recently.
That's a Pros D video, and it's very funny.
No, that's what it was. It was the Pros D video.
Yeah,
he's good. I'm gonna watch Blackberry
so
again.
Good.
I watched it in all Japanese. How's Alexa Bliss? Like, how's her voiceover work?
She's fine. I mean, one thing about these like J dramas is she's I forget the wrestler's name, but Jackie Sato's tag team partner in Beauty Pair.
Ah, okay.
But I will say, like, so I have a friend of mine who he's very much into Japanese culture stuff, and he happened to watch wrestling. Like, when I lived with him, he really got into NXT and stuff. I would recommend it to him, but more so because he's been to Japan, he's done Duolingo, like really into anime and video game stuff, more so than the wrestling stuff. So I think you're right in that. I would not necessarily recommend it to wrestling fans, but people who happen to be more to the cultural aspect of it.
I think it's a good point because so J dramas are very like, it's like YA stuff. It's very big performances, and just like the Japanese performances, the dubbed performances are pretty big also. Okay, hard pivot. Because none of this stuff got any Oscar or Emmy love. Let's talk about the movie that I recommended for you guys. It was Woody Allen's Crimes and Misdemeanors. It's two intersecting stories about guys who are unhappy and need a change and have like sort of parallel problems in their lives. One of them's an eye doctor who is having an affair, and the woman he's having an affair with, he's played by Martin Landau. The one he's having an affair with, played by Angelica Houston, wants to go public with the affair, and he doesn't know what to do because it will ruin his life. And the other story is the more typical Woody Allen story. This is a very cool movie because it has like the two of the three styles of Woody Allen movies combined. So that's a more serious one. And in the more comedic one, Woody Allen plays sort of like a indie documentary filmmaker who's interested in very specific Yiddish philosophy, and his long-suffering wife wants him to be more successful, so she sets him up with her producer brother, played by Alan Alda, who wants him to do a documentary about himself. He falls in love with another, I don't know what her job, I actually never figured out what Mia Farrow's job was on the set, but
She's like a producer.
Yeah, right? Must be.
Something like
that's what it is. She's the producer of the TV series that this Alan Alda documentary is going to fit into, and Woody Allen wants his old depressed man documentary to be in the TV series instead. Alan falls in love with her and doesn't really seem to care what his wife thinks, just wants to pursue this affair with Mia Farrow. I watched this for the first time a couple years ago at my father-in-law's house and had a blast. It's one of his favorite movies. I really, really enjoyed it. And I thought, and it's pretty underseen by people our age. So I thought, I just thought you guys would like it. So Jake, I'll start with you. What'd you think?
Yeah, I think it is underseen, and it is a little bit hard to find. I actually had to go to one of my public libraries and borrow it on DVD. It's not streaming anywhere. So, and I'm really glad you recommended it because it felt different than a lot of the Woody Allen movies that I've seen. And just even looking at the box art, the cover of it, I was like, oh, look, Martin Landau and Woody Allen standing next to each other in tuxedos. It's going to be like, they're going to be buddies, and they've got stuff going on in this movie. And they don't interact like at all, really, until, of course, spoiler alerts, we're spoiling all the movies we're talking about, but I mean, they don't really interact at all until that last scene in the movie. And I think that's just a really interesting way to finally connect those two stories. I liked this movie a lot. Alan Alda, my gosh, everything he did in this movie, it was just so pretentious and over the top and perfect. And I laughed at almost every scene that he was in. I loved him so much in this movie. And, Woody Allen's doing his Woody Allen thing. Martin Landau was terrific. I mean, those scenes that he had with his brother, I thought were so good. And, Angelica Houston's scenes, I thought were very good. I mean, there's a lot of really interesting, scenarios in this movie, a lot of like moral questions that a lot of this stuff I don't think comes up in a lot of the Woody Allen movies, that are a lot more straightforward comedies. And there is some like funny stuff in this movie, especially in the Woody Allen, portion of the story. But there's just a lot more depth, I think, to this movie than there is to some of the other Woody Allen movies. And that kind of surprised me. I didn't expect a lot of it. I had heard of this movie, of course. I was, familiar with the title, but I really didn't know what it was about or where it was going to go. And it was really interesting to watch it all unfold. And really high marks for Crimes and Misdemeanors. Thank you for recommending it.
You're welcome. Kevin, what'd you think?
Liked it, did not love it, and that's mostly because of the B story. I love A story's incredible. Loved Martin Landau, amazing. I liked the B story scenes with Alan Alda in them. I really hated Woody Allen's character. It annoyed me. Anytime there was a scene of the B story where Alan Alda wasn't involved, I was like, can we get back to the A story now, please? Mm-hmm. I just didn't like that portion of the movie much. There's nothing redeemable about or likable about that character. I just found him very annoying and frustrating.
My favorite line in the movie is from the Woody Allen portion. It's after he's gone to visit his sister, who's played by Joanna Gleason, who has popped up in so many movies I've watched this year. It's bizarre. She was just in Between the Temples, which I saw. And she shows up in Woody Allen stuff here and there. She's just a big staple of comedy in the 80s and still working today in her 70s. But she tells him about how she went on a date and the guy took her home and tied her up and defecated on her. And the funniest line I think in the whole movie is Alan sitting on his own bed talking to his wife, being like, my sister told me that she was defecated on today. I just don't know what to make of humanity anymore. That's so perfect. This is the second time I've seen it, and it works so much better, I think, the more you've seen it and the more you know about it. So Alan is obsessed with Russian literature, like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. He made a movie, I think 4 or 5 years before this, called Love and Death, which is also very good and much more of like a slapstick comedy, like kind of like Airplane or a Mel Brooks movie, where he plays a Russian guy who's caught up in the Napoleonic Wars, and jokes abound. But it's doing like Crime and Punishment. And this movie is also doing Crime and Punishment, but funny. And that's why you get these philosophical moments in between, like Martin Landau, after he's, again, we're in full spoiler territory here, after he's told his brother to hire someone to kill Angelica Houston to keep her quiet, he starts having these flashbacks to his childhood and the conversations being had around the table. And I thought the conversation about, does might make right? What would we think about Hitler had the Holocaust been fully successful? You know, you don't expect those things in a comedy movie, but they show up here. And I feel like, to me, it was pretty seamless, because on the other end, you have Woody Allen, who is just not engaging with the morality of what he's doing. Like, he tells his niece immediately that he wants to have an affair with this woman. And he goes, and I'm married, but whatever, small obstacle.
Yeah.
I love that juxtaposition. But at the end of the movie, the guy who committed the murder feels good and has gotten away with it. And the guy who ended up not having the affair, not for lack of trying, but who didn't get what he wanted and is now getting a divorce, and he's still unhappy. And Martin Landau gets to go off and kiss his wife and leave. And the guy who did everything right is sad. And that's very different from the end of Crime and Punishment, where, spoiler alert if you haven't read Crime and Punishment yet, the main character admits that he committed a murder and goes to Siberia, where he, ironically, I mean, I think Alan deliberately went in the opposite direction. He becomes a very religious Christian, whereas the men in this movie have completely flaunted their Jewish teaching. The thing that connects the two stories is Martin Landau is treating for blindness Woody Allen's brother-in-law, who is a rabbi, and getting advice from him about what he should do about this affair that he admits to having. I think it's great. I think it's one of the top 3 Woody Allen movies. That I've only seen half of them. But
well, I think it's really interesting too that by far, you mentioned the rabbi. I mean, obviously by far the most righteous man in the movie is the one who, outside of Angelica Houston, who dies, but the most righteous man in the movie is the one who suffers the most because he's going blind, and that sucks, and that's not fair. Whereas you've got Woody Allen, who wants to run around on his wife, and who doesn't get what he wants, but he also, I mean, he doesn't really get like punished for it necessarily either. I mean, he's headed for a divorce either way. I mean, that's kind of established early on. He talks about like how he and his wife haven't been sleeping together and they're not particularly happy. So I think, this affair that he's pursuing with Mia Farrow is not specifically leading to his divorce. I mean, that's happening anyway. And then of course, like I said, Martin Landau pretty much gets away with it scot-free. So I mean, you've got these two guys who are both morally questionable to varying degrees. I mean, Martin Landau, I think obviously more than the other, and they get off, pretty light. Whereas, the rabbi loses his sight. That's not fair.
Yeah, that's absolutely deliberate. Kevin, have you seen many Woody Allen movies? Like, let's take the grossness of Woody Allen himself out of it for a second. Have you seen any of his other movies?
I don't think so.
This is your first. Now, this is an interesting one to watch first, because it's a real. He really has, I think, 3, like I mentioned earlier, 3 kinds of movies. Early in his career, it seemed like he might go the Mel Brooks route. He does like parody, spoofy kinds of movies. In fact, his first movie, he does like a James Bond parody. He does kind of like a Roger Corman style, like tweaking of other movies in his movies with footage from those other movies. Then later on, he does the more grounded comedies like Annie Hall and Hannah and Her Sisters and Half of This. And then this is sort of another transition into movies that are more serious, like Match Point and Vicky Cristina Barcelona, things like that, where there really isn't much comedy. Match Point is a murder mystery, or not a murder mystery, but like a thriller. So it's interesting to see, probably threw you into the deep end with the wrong one first. It's hard to appreciate it, like because you could watch this and be like, this is tonally jarring. You have this really serious Martin Landau thing, and then Alan's off like putzing and yitting around. I can see that being tough.
I don't know if it was even a tonally thing that it was, but it was just like, wow, by the end of this movie, I'm glad the guy who got away with murder did, and that Woody Allen is suffering because he sucks. So,
Jake, this got nominated for Oscars, didn't it?
It did, yeah. It was nominated for 3 Oscars. It lost all 3 of them. Woody was up for Best Director this year for this movie. He lost to Oliver Stone for Born on the 4th of July. He was also up for, Woody was nominated for the original screenplay Oscar, which he lost to, I can't remember who wrote it, but he lost to Dead Poets Society.
Dead Poets Society.
Yeah, was the winner that year, which, if you look at the other nominees in that category, I'd say not the best choice for winner, but not a bad movie or anything. And then also Martin Landau was up for Best Supporting Actor that year, but he lost to Denzel Washington from Glory, which, Denzel, Glory, the single tier. I mean, come on.
Interestingly enough, they gave it to him for another good performance a few years later in Ed Wood. Yeah, I just watched Ed Wood for the first time kind of recently, and he's great in it. It's not a great movie. It's a very good movie. It doesn't have an ending, which is kind of odd, but kind of like Alice in Wonderland, another great movie with no ending. But Landau is great, and he plays Boris Karloff, which is, tough. Boris Karloff was a washed-up, iconic actor with a terrible drug addiction, and you don't expect that in a Tim Burton movie, but they handle it pretty well.
Yeah, I'm not a big Tim Burton fan, but I do really like Ed Wood.
I haven't seen it in a long time, but I remember really liking it. Yeah. It's just, I also remember that was kind of right around the time I started watching the Oscars or kind of paying attention. And I just remember people were pissed, and me, being like super into Pulp Fiction at the time. Like, why didn't Samuel L. Jackson win the Oscar for, because that's who Martin Landau beat that year, was Samuel L. Jackson, and a couple other good nominees that year. But, the career Oscar is definitely a thing. And Martin Landau certainly has enough good performances to back up winning 1 Oscar.
And the fact of the matter is, like, in a transition time, which Pulp Fiction is a transition movie in the industry, you're not going to get your flowers that way. And also, which movie is more remembered? People like Ed Wood. People are obsessed still with Pulp Fiction. So,
yeah.
And just like 94, 89, both crazy good years for movies. So it's hard not to feel like they're snubs when there's so many great films to choose from.
So let's talk about our favorite movies of 1989. We always let our guests go first.
Oh, wow.
You can talk about your honorable mentions if you have any, but let us know your top 10.
Yeah, I got a couple honorable mentions. So I want to give a shout out to The Wizard. If you're talking about movies you loved as a kid, that's one of mine. I am still a Nintendo person, so getting to watch that and see them, a fun cross-country adventure that results in them getting to play Super Mario 3 is just super fun. The craziest thing was I saw it on Nickelodeon first, and then rented the VHS years later at a Hollywood Video. And the Nickelodeon cuts the scene where Jenny Lewis screams, "He touched my breast!" in the casino. So I was so thrown by that, but it made me laugh very hard the first time I saw it.
Your impression is uncanny.
I know, right? You thought Jenny Lewis had entered the chat. And then the second shout out I'll give is to Roger and Me. Just it's a great movie, but I haven't seen it for a couple decades, so I really wish I could have had a chance to rewatch it before this. But it's a really good and I think sometimes forgotten about Michael Moore film.
We don't really talk about Michael Moore positively on this podcast because of what he did to Jake.
I'm just saying. I thought it was a good documentary. Anyways, so my number 10 is Field of Dreams. This is one I watched for the first time recently. It's a great story about taking leaps when sometimes things don't make sense, and having the support of your family in doing so. And I think watching it around the time that oh gosh, why can't I think of his name? Recently passed.
Ray Liotta, James Earl Jones.
James Earl Jones, yes, definitely.
Like half that cast.
So yeah, it's a classic for a reason. It was really good. However, it is not my favorite baseball movie of 1989. That would go to my number 9 choice, Major League. If I'm being honest with myself, I have them both at 4 stars, but Major League's the one I watch more. It's a comedy with a heart of gold, and Jake Taylor making that final play will cause a man to tear up. Just ask Chuck Taylor. For comedies, though, I also have at number 8, National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation. I don't have a ton of stuff that every year at Christmas I must watch, but if I'm in the mood for a Christmas movie, it's usually this or Muppets Christmas Carol, and sometimes Scrooge that I'll go and watch. Just really funny, feel good holiday movie. Back to the Future Part 2 is my number 7 movie. I actually think it's the Back to the Future I've seen the most, with a caveat though, when I was 2, 3, and 4 and I saw it, the Jaws shark really scared the heck out of me, especially in the beginning when it's coming out and it's still really pixelated. So maybe I would leave the room and then come back later. Number 6 is Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. The Iron Maiden joke is still maybe one of the funniest jokes I witnessed for the very first time when I watched a movie, and I think it almost ages better for having one of the better legacy sequels of these movie franchises. Number 5 is The Little Mermaid, for my money. Top 5, top 3 Disney animated classic, and I believe both of you gave it very high marks in your ranking podcast. Go back and listen to it in the archives. Great music, great story. What more can you say? For animated films about teenage women trying to come into their own and figure stuff out, I go with number 4, Kiki's Delivery Service, as my favorite of the two. Also very poignant with today of finding something you love and are good at and making it a hustle. And when Kiki does some self-care by not going to a party and then regretting it later, I felt that deep within my soul. And it's just has all the whimsy and fun of your Miyazaki movies. Number 3, I have When Harry Met Sally, all-time great romantic comedy, often replicated, but nobody quite hits the heart of the matter like everyone in this movie did. It's a classic for a reason. Number 2 is Do the Right Thing, still very poignant to this day in disappointing ways, but man, it when it gets to that last scene and the destruction of the restaurant, which is what I was alluding to earlier, it is quite a shocker. And man, it can get to be a tough watch, but it is remarkable and a classic for a reason here. I think when I think of screenplay in '89, I'm like, man, Do the Right Thing and When Harry Met Sally, those two would be up there as top picks for me. But my number 1 is maybe one of the movies I've watched the most over my lifetime. It still makes me laugh. It still makes me feel good. It's an underdog story. And the more I thought about it too, this is a movie that should be and will be after this in my top 4 on Letterboxd, and that's UHF. Love that movie.
Well, I will say a little bit about it because it's not on my list.
Which I know you both have seen, but don't have it ranked on Letterboxd. It's so funny. It's got really great gags, immensely quotable, and it's just that feel good movie of someone who gets this TV studio and makes it successful, and it's the little guy going up against the big TV studio. So even if you take the humor out of it, you don't like Weird Al, whatever, it's still just a really good base story at the heart of it. And it's just a movie I've watched so many times through owning the VHS, the DVD, the Blu-ray. And I actually got a chance a few years ago to watch it for the first time with Al himself, Tig Notaro, and Emo Phillips, which was a blast. But it's one of those things where, am I going to tell you it's the best movie on my list? No, but it is my favorite movie of 1989.
And thus, for you, it is the best movie of 1989, in my
Absolutely.
opinion. You liked it so much that for those watching on YouTube, you ascended to heaven, apparently. You are so washed out right now. What is going on?
My windows are open, and I guess the sun pivoted, so I'll close one of my blinds.
It was perfect timing. Kevin, our lists are there's a lot of the same stuff. In some cases, in a lot of the same places. Couple of honorable mentions real quick. Honey, I Shrunk the Kid was a big one for me growing up. I haven't watched this in a long time. I actually don't even have it rated on Letterboxd, but I have such fond feelings about it that I have it on my list in honorable mentions. Drugstore Cowboy is an interesting one. It's an early Gus Van Sant movie that is about people with drug problems. It's a very 90s movie, even though it takes place, it's a period piece. It was made in '89. It feels like the 90s, but it's about an earlier time even. Stars Matt Dillon and Kelly Lynch. Pretty good. And then I have Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade and Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure as 11 and 12 in my list. They could swap with 10, which is Ghostbusters 2, which I've for sure seen more often than Ghostbusters 1. I really liked the whole Vigo shtick. I liked all the goop. I think Ghostbusters 2 is actually really funny. A lot of people recently, since the new Ghostbusters are so poorly received, have talked about how Ghostbusters 2 was really unnecessary, but that's dumb, and I think a stupid way to think about movies, because Ghostbusters 1 is really just a bunch of guys goofing off for an hour and a half. So how necessary is that? And that's not to say I don't like Ghostbusters. I like Ghostbusters a lot. My number 9 is Heathers. This movie reverberates to today a lot. Michael Lehman directed this. It stars Winona Ryder. A lot of people have been talking about it lately because this was, I think, maybe her first dark role. This movie is about kids who kill each other in high school. And it was a big one for Christian Slater. Shannon Doherty, rest in peace, had a really good performance in this one. And you get a lot of stuff that's kind of like this now, with Bottoms is sort of like a real zany comedy version of this. Mean Girls is like a lighter version of this. A lot of good stuff has come because of Heathers. My number 8 is a Ron Howard movie that I watched for the first time kind of recently. It's Parenthood, starring Steve Martin. Really heartfelt movie. Diane Wiest is incredible here. Mary Steenburgen's fine. Jason Robards in one of his later roles, really great as Steve Martin's asshole dad. Rick Moranis is wonderful as if you were ever to watch a movie and dislike Rick Moranis, it's this one. He plays the worst version of himself. And Tom Hulce, who, I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right. Is it Hulce or Hulch?
I thought it was Hulsey.
I'm going to take your word for it. Tom Hulce, who is best known for playing Amadeus in Amadeus. is like a really fun loser here.
Oh, let's not forget about Keanu Reeves in that movie also.
Keanu Reeves is a very early role. This was a great year for him between this and Bill and Ted, but he plays the daughter's Steve Martin's niece's boyfriend, Diane Wiest's daughter's boyfriend, and he's also like a lovable loser. Oh, and Joaquin Phoenix in his, I think, debut as the little brother of the girl that Keanu Reeves dates. And he doesn't go by Joaquin here. He had a different name when he started, and then River convinced him to go by Joaquin.
Yeah.
My number 7 is Back to the Future Part 2. This was my favorite Back to the Future growing up. I like the first one a little more now. I think I might even like the third one a little more now, but I like Back to the Future 2 a lot. It's obviously it's my number 7 movie of 1989. I just watched it again. Netflix had these up recently. And yeah, it's really fun. It doesn't stop. It's like the most breakneck, I think, of all the Back to the Futures. It really just moves from like, this terrible thing is happening to this terrible thing is happening to, well, let's just show the family in the house for a minute. Now this terrible thing is happening, and now Donald Trump is in charge of the world. And it was very prophetic. My number 6 is Crimes and Misdemeanors. I love it. Woody Allen's mesh of his two more prominent styles, and really interesting. I really would hope that more people watch Crimes and Misdemeanors. It's really hard to find. Buy a DVD or do what Jake did and go to your local library and find a copy. My number 5 is also Little Mermaid. It did rank highly in my Disney. It's funny. It's my number 5 movie of 1989. I think it might be higher on my list of Disney movies. Wonderful, wonderful movie. And my number 4 is also Kiki's Delivery Service. Jake asked me when we did 1990 why I didn't have Kiki's Delivery Service on it, because I talk about movies when they came out in their home country, and Kiki's came out in 89 in Japan. But yeah, I have them back to back also. My number 3 is Do the Right Thing. I got to watch this recently at a local movie night at a bar near my house with a bunch of other people, and the conversation afterwards was really cool that we had, and it was just a lot of fun. And I mean, the movie is, what do they call it? It's like the leader of sweaty movies. It's a movie where you feel like it's hot. Apparently, Spike Lee took sternos, like catering sternos, and put them in front of the camera to give the effect that it was hotter than it actually was, like the waves and stuff like that. Movie's awesome. It's a Greek tragedy, and they have like the Greek chorus in there. But what did I say in my Letterboxd review? It's a Greek chorus, but one of the guys' names is Sweet Dick Willie. God bless you, Spike Lee. My number 2 is Cameron Crowe's debut, Say Anything. It's my favorite John Cusack performance. I wish I Own Sky had a better career, because I had such a massive, unbelievable crush on her in Say Anything. And it's a really sweet rom-com with a pretty serious undertone in it of economic anxiety. I think it's excellent. And my number 1 is When Harry Met Sally. This is, in my opinion, the best rom-com of all time. I think it's Rob Reiner's best or second best movie. I don't know. Princess Bride's pretty great.
Spinal Tap. It's up there too.
I don't like it as much as these two. It's my favorite Billy Crystal movie. It's my favorite Meg Ryan. I think Meg Ryan is doing something here that she doesn't come close to in the rest of her career. She is untouchable here. And then also Carrie Fisher, so funny. Bruno Kirby, a lot of dead people in this movie. One of the all-timers, fully informed the careers of Nora Ephron and Nancy Meyers. Nora Ephron wrote and produced this movie, so you can feel her fingerprints all over it. Terrific.
It's a shame that they went with Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan twice in films, and not because he's the big Hollywood star versus Billy Crystal, when I think they had much better chemistry.
Well, it's funny you say that, because Tom Hanks was not yet Tom Hanks when they made those movies. But yes, Hollywood was not so interested in the little Jewish guy. They wanted the tall, handsome guy who was stealing Michael Keaton's career to be the star of these movies. And that's it.
Okay. I've got a couple honorable mentions that I'll mention because several of my honorable mentions were on your guys' lists. So I want to mention that they're on here. Honey, I Shrunk the Kids is one of my honorable mentions. Bill and Ted is one of mine. Parenthood is one of my honorable mentions. Dead Poets Society that I mentioned earlier. Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade is an honorable mention. Back to the Future 2 is an honorable mention. Also, The Adventures of Milo and Otis, a sweet little movie about a dog and a cat that was released in Japan in 1986, but we got it in the States in 89. Those are all some of my honorable mention movies. And also Tim Burton's Batman is one of my honorable mention movies as well. I do enjoy that movie still.
Can I say something? I think it is absolutely insane that I am learning today that The Adventures of Milo and Otis is a Japanese film.
Yeah, and it's not that insane because I watched it just a couple years ago with Viv, and I was like, oh yeah, I remember this movie from when I was a kid. It's about a dog and a cat, and it'll be fun to watch with Viv. And so that's when I looked it up. At that point, I was like, what the I couldn't believe that it was it was directed by, it's a total Japanese movie directed by a Japanese director. Yeah, it came out in 3 years before it came to the States, because I just remember seeing it as a kid. I'm like, oh yeah, it's just about a dog and a cat. Like
Same director as Little Nemo, the Dream Master, or Adventures in Slumberland, which is based on a video game, also a Japanese movie that you could be mistaken for thinking was an American movie, because I think they came out around the same time in both places. But it's and also a 1989 movie.
Synergy all over the place. My number 10 is the Disney's The Little Mermaid. A lot has been said about that already. Great movie, great songs, great animation, just a great movie. My number 9 is Oliver Stone's Born on the 4th of July, with Tom Cruise giving out one of his best performances as a veteran who speaks out against the atrocities of war. My number 8 is the movie we talked about at great length, Woody Allen's Crimes and Misdemeanors. My number 7 appeared on Kevin's list, one of my favorite comedies, one of my favorite baseball movies, that's Major League. Watched this movie so many times as a kid with my brother, but I was young, so we had to watch the edited version that aired on TV, and I watched it so many times, we knew all the replacement swears that they had put in. So like by the time we watched the R-rated version, it sounded weird to us, because we just remembered them, all the edited words that they had put in there. My number 6, I know we just talked about how much I hate Michael Moore, but I do have to give credit where it is due to Roger and Me. It's a great movie, and it was kind of a game changer when it came out. Did get a chance to see it on the big screen with an introduction by him at his film festival. So yeah, I mean, he sucks, but that movie is still pretty good, and it is, it was kind of a big deal when it came out. My number 5 is, again, I made both your lists, When Harry Met Sally. Amazing comedy. Everybody in this movie is hilarious. Almost everything everybody says, and it is funny. Just, yeah, classic from start to finish. My number 4 is, Brad, you had this on your list very high. I was happy to see that. Cameron Crowe's Say Anything. Again, just an amazing romantic movie. For the characters being in high school, I think they're very mature, very, very interesting characters. They actually have a lot going on. The character John Mahoney's performance in this is really good. And for a debut feature film too, I think it's very excellent. And the soundtrack is just bangers. And my number 3 is a great baseball movie. This is on Kevin's list also, Field of Dreams. I'm in the bag for baseball movies, and this is, I think, one of the best ones. I love Kevin Costner in this, and I love the end. I mean, I get choked up just thinking about the ending when he finally gets to have a catch with his old man. I mean, what's more pure than that? You've got a great Ray Liotta performance. You got James Earl Jones. You got Burt Lancaster, Amy Madigan, young Gabby Hoffman is in this. Just an amazing movie that I watch every couple of years. My number 2, Brad, this would have appeared on an earlier list for you, but came out in the States in 1989. We had a whole podcast episode about this, but my number 2 is Grave of the Fireflies. Just an amazing film in every aspect. I mean, the animation is great. The story is super depressing, but it's just really, just an excellent film. One of the probably best animated movies ever made. And then my number 1 is Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing, which, yeah, I think is, again, one of the best films probably ever made. I've been trying to get my wife to watch this. She's not seen it, but the build up to the final climactic moment is just is incredible. And then when they get to that final sequence, the payoff is just, it's easily the best movie that the best joint, that Spike has ever made.
I think it's crazy that this movie about race nominated Danny Aiello for Best Supporting Actor and not Ozzie Davis, who put in one of the best performances of his entire career. Mm-hmm. What a shonda, what a disaster.
That is a shonda. That's a major shonda. And again, I mentioned earlier that Dead Poets Society won the award for Best Original Screenplay about a bunch of white kids who have a problem in school versus Do the Right Thing, one of the most original screenplays in years, if not ever, and they passed that over. And of course, Spike didn't get nominated for Best Director, and didn't until like 2020 for anything. So yeah, Do the Right Thing, massive oversight by the Academy.
Do either of you read Drew McWeeney's stuff?
I don't know who that is.
Okay, so he's done film and stuff, but he also he is a film critic, and he does this great Substack called The Last 80s Newsletter You'll Ever Read. He is currently in the midst of watching every film that came out in the U.S. in the 80s, which I think he said is like 2,600 films or something like that. But in his opinion, Do the Right Thing is the best movie of the 80s period, not just 1989. So for someone like with that to say that, I'm like, whoa, that's pretty big.
Yeah, I think it's totally reasonable.
Yeah.
Did any of us put Batman in our honorable mentions?
I don't think it's that great.
Oh, I love you guys. I don't think it's good either. I feel so seen right now. This is wonderful.
I told you I don't really love Tim Burton in general.
Oh, I think it's just one of his less good. Like I think Batman Returns is very good, and I think Batman.
I do like that more than I do like.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and,
I would like.
and I
that
think
for sure.
Batman is very whatever. I think Edward Scissorhands is sort of untouchable when it comes to Tim Burton, but and Pee Wee's Big Adventure, but beyond that, things do tend to fall off when it comes to Burton. Okay, cool. This was great. Thank you, Kevin. What are you working on these days? What are your fun little projects and big projects?
I mean, not a lot, but I will say, we're recording this in fall of 2024. So we've just passed the 20th anniversary of the first episode of Lost coming out. So if you want to go back and listen to my Lost podcast from Broadcast Depth, my buddy and I, Ben Lundy, went through the entire television series and also touched upon a lot of the side projects, even stuff like the 2007 WGA strike that affected the show, a lot of stuff like that. So if you're one of those people who's rewatching it or watching it for the very first time, which I've seen a lot of people are doing, that's a fun little companion piece as you're watching along. And then Brad and I have covered all of Adventure Time on our show, Flooping the Pig, including the entire Cartoon Network series, the Max series is Distant Lands, and Fiona and Cake. And I don't remember when Fiona and Cake Series 2 was coming out, Season 2, but we will definitely, come back with that at some point.
Yeah, I don't think that's dated, but when it is, we'll let you know, because I'm excited to relaunch Flooping the Pig. And there's a movie coming out too, I think.
Oh, that's news to me.
That's been rumored forever.
But I also, I do wrestling stuff and all that. But if you want to keep up with that, you can follow me at K413 on Twitter, and I post anytime I do a review or something like that.
Amazing. Thanks, Kevin. We really appreciate it. We'll be back next week with, depending on whether you're watching on YouTube or listening on Spotify. On YouTube, you can finally see our Alexander Payne rankings. On Spotify, you can finally hear our Godzilla Monsterverse ranking. Anyway, thank you, Kevin. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks, Kevin.